So good morning and welcome to the 17th installment of the US-Asia Institute's webinar series, Southeast Asia in Focus, entitled The Road to Sustainability in 2024, What's in Store for Southeast Asia? For those of you who have attended our webinars before, welcome back. For those new to the US-Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. My name is Trong Mishra and I'm a program assistant at USAI. For background, USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 45-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. First, we would like to give a special thanks to USAI's corporate stakeholders for helping to make this program possible. They are SANS, AIG, ConocoPhillips, FedEx, Walmart, Philip Morris International, Fairfield Maxwell, and Suntory. Additionally, all attendees should be aware that today's event will be on the record, recorded, and uploaded to the USAI YouTube channel. We ask that you please remain muted and keep your camera turned off throughout the speaker presentations. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please feel free to type it in the chat box or wait to say your question during the Q&A session at the end. Now moving on to today's program, I would like to introduce our moderator for this webinar, Dr. Raphael Heffron. He is a professor in energy and justice and the social contract at the Université de Pau et de Pays de la Loire in France. His research is in achieving a sustainable and just transition to a low-carbon economy and combines a mix of law, policy, and economics. He has published over 200 publications of different types and is the most cited scholar in his field worldwide. We are very fortunate to have him with us today, so without further ado, I will pass it over to Dr. Raphael Heffron to begin today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Turan, and thank you for the invitation to present today and to chair the session. And let's say it's an area that I've been focusing on for a number of years, and I would be happy to share some publications in the area to any of the attendees. We have two very exciting speakers today. They'll speak for 15 minutes each, and then we will have the opportunity to ask them a series of questions. And first up, we have all the way from Norway, we have a senior research fellow, Roman, who is also head of the research group on climate and energy. And he works at NUPI, which is the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. So one of the leading, let's say, places of scholarship, I think, globally for work, let's say, generally in international relations. So it'll be very exciting to hear his perspective, and he has extensive research and consulting experience across many different agencies, many different countries, and let's say as we're discussing today, specifically with the Asian Development Bank, which works widely in the Southeast Asian region. Second to speak today is Brian, who is a senior fellow and director, also working on a range of issues with energy, water, and sustainability, working for Stimson, which you can see in the background of his picture currently. He also has extensive research and consulting and also writing on different projects in the region. He has a book out that was published in 2019, The Last Days of the Mighty Mekong, and has done extensive work around the region, and also has lived and worked in the region as well, and he may give some insight into that when he gives his talk, and has worked on different projects. And if you do look up his profile, you will see some of those projects specifically highlighted. So for myself, you've heard an introduction, and I just wanted to, let's say, before I pass the floor over to both Roman and Brian, I just wanted to give a few of my own perspectives, maybe just highlighting maybe more from an international perspective, and then I will allow Roman and Brian to focus more specifically on the region, but I will make a few references, maybe just coming from my own work, but maybe as maybe more of a, let's say, scene setter for today. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen. So talking about sustainability, for me, really, one of the key issues as you're thinking about today, things are more visible than ever before. And these are 4 images from the city of Jakarta. And this, for me, expresses why it's a policy. It has become a big policy issue for all policymakers around the world. And that's why I think we are seeing action. It's also why we are seeing increased investment going into the whole of the Southeast Asian region. And it is because this, if you look at this image from Jakarta, the capital city of Indonesia in Southeast Asia, and it has a greater population of 28 million. They've already announced where the new capital city is going to be, because this city is going, let's say, sinking, and by 2050 will have, let's say, there will have been extreme damage that it will be underwater. So they've already announced where the new capital is, maybe 2.5 years ago, and they've already started construction of that new capital. But when we think of the scale of the issues facing the world today, this for me is one of the biggest challenges, to move all these people essentially to a new city, a new capital city. And that really is a warning to the region of Southeast Asia, but also globally. And I think that's why we have seen many, many policymakers, companies, all talk about this. They use this word justice. And if you're thinking of the annual climate change conference organized by the UN every year, this is something that they all are working towards, to try and achieve different targets for 2030 and 2050. And this has been sparked by the Paris COP21 agreement in 2015. And also in the same year, what we're talking about today, the sustainability, you had the introduction of the UN Sustainable Development Goals in the year 2015. And what we're trying to work towards there are 2030, 2050 energy and climate goals. And we are trying to do that in a just and sustainable way. And what we're trying to achieve is reduce the impacts of climate change, also address issues around inequality, and also switch to new clean technology. And we see in the Southeast Asian region, we see a lot of these issues being addressed. Obviously, climate change is happening. There are extremes being felt by these countries, such as the example in Indonesia. We see different policies improving on addressing inequality. We see a lot of regional development in some of the Southeast Asian nations. And we also see a big push to clean technology. And we see Vietnam having been very successful in developing a lot of clean technology. Indonesia is trying to develop more. And we also see India close by improving a lot in terms of solar energy. So there are big, let's say, developments happening. And what we want to see really is an acceleration of that development. And I will just quickly talk about a relationship really which needs to improve. Is we really need to see a new relationship develop between the three key stakeholders: government, private companies, the private sector, and also citizens. And this relationship needs to be adjusted as we move forward in terms of having a more just and sustainable world. We need to think of improving the relationship around risk, reward, and responsibility. We need to see more of that risk shared between the private sector and the government and civil society. We need to see some of that reward shared. Too often it is private sector companies having too much of the profits, and maybe there needs to be a fair distribution. And then responsibility. We need to see those climate change impacts being addressed and the other stakeholders taking more responsibility. It shouldn't always be left to, let's say, the citizens to face the responsibility of climate change. And that sort of responsibility issue projects an image for the future generations, that we need to take account of future generations in this debate. So let's say some of the work I've been doing is thinking about this relationship between risk, reward, and responsibility, and how that should change in the future in and around energy and climate change issues. And we highlight that as a issue around a social contract and taking responsibility. And it sort of builds on this key document from the United Nations on future-proofing. And this issue of future-proofing is really to improve decision-making. You can see at the bottom, you're trying to ensure that policymakers and corporate decision makers are making the best decisions they can today. And it's a decision that they will be able to say in 5 or 10 years that they made this decision with the best information possible at that particular time. So they use all the scientific data, all the risk management strategic data, the environmental impact data, and they brought this all together and made the most responsible decision they could at a particular time. So I just wanted to get across a few of those key challenges, let's say globally, what I'm working on, but also what internationally has been worked on, such as at the UN climate change conferences every year. They are talking about that just energy transition or just transition pathways, how we move in the future, and then addressing that relationship between the key stakeholders is how we are going to get there. And this addressing that relationship of risk, reward, and responsibility is something that also the UN is focused on in terms of trying to future-proof our decision making. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then hand over to Roman, who will speak for 15 minutes. Then we will have Brian speak for 15 minutes, and we will have a final 15 minutes for a Q&A. So I've already given Roman an introduction, so I'll just go straight over to Roman, and you can give your talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rafael. It's a pleasure to get such an introduction from you, and also your comments about the work that we've been doing. It's also a pleasure to be invited to the seminar to highlight some of the key issues that are shaping the region in terms of the climate change and the prospects, as well as progress for decarbonization. And I'm also thankful to Rafael for covering some of the key issue areas that relate to the region. Those questions are highly important and relevant, and those questions, I think, deserve most of our attention in terms of scholarship, but also in terms of the policymakers who are working on the region. And in my presentation, I will touch upon also some of the aspects that relate to climate change, its impacts, some of the issues that relate to the link between climate change and decarbonization. So bringing together climate change adaptation and also climate change mitigation status and progress in ASEAN. And then finally focusing on some areas of clean energy transition in ASEAN. That is basically based on some of the research that we did before. So let me start from the overview of some of the key risks for the region, something that Rafael already mentioned and discussed about. So ASEAN, that includes 10 countries, is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to climate change. And some of the impacts of climate change are particularly strong and most immediate in this region, such as, for example, the rising sea levels, which is seen as being one of the main impacts for the region. And it's one of those impacts that may have most of the devastating consequences unless properly addressed. And ASEAN is so vulnerable because most of its population is living very close to the coastal areas. This is where you also have a very high share of agricultural productivity and also activities, which is also can be under very severe threat of climate change and including the rising sea level. And of course, with every, I don't know, 10 to 20 centimeters of sea level rising, this can actually lead to some dramatic consequences for some of the coastal areas, including some of the biggest cities across the region. We also see that over the last years, there are more frequent and more severe flooding taking place. Also, we know that the region is experiencing quite extreme weather events, and those are to continue again unless the climate change is tackled. But at least within the next 5 to 10 years, some predict that, well, the intensity of those extreme weather events is likely to grow. Plus, of course, this fact, as I mentioned, that the lack of coastal land may actually result in some severe food security issues, as well as the limited ability and also mobility of the population, which can have also quite dramatic social consequences. So in terms of the purely economic risks, one can say, well, there are some studies that show that the whole region may lose up to 11% of its GDP by the next century, unless no action is taken. Or it can actually experience even more if the climate change is rapidly growing and, for example, the goals of the Paris Agreement are not properly met. So, of course, this would also have impact on the fisheries, rising unemployment, and I think this is particularly important in this part of Asia because this is where most of the global economic growth is taking place. This is where you have some of the most dynamic, I would say, economic societies and also the economies which are growing. So this might be also quite an important fact going forward, especially with the rising population and the overall economic growth that is taking place in the region. Also, I should say that these climate change risks, they also have pretty severe consequences with respect to the overall poverty levels. They might also lead to the rising income inequality among different states. And what's more important is to say that even though the region is located, of course, in one geographical area, many countries experience pretty, I would say, unique consequences of climate change, and this requires quite targeted support for individual countries, where basically it's very difficult to come up with a solution that would be like a one-size-fits-all solution. So it's really important to take into account the specific geographies, landscape, as well as socioeconomic situation when dealing with the climate impacts in the region. And of course, I know that many international organizations are heavily involved in assisting the region in terms of adaptation to climate change. For example, the Asian Development Bank is, of course, quite an important player, the World Bank and many others. So they really provide a lot of assistance in terms of awareness raising, but still more can be done, and especially with this rapidly growing and intensifying impacts of climate change on the region. So I would say that at the moment, what's happening, and if you also look at the last 10 years, despite the fact that the ASEAN countries are highly vulnerable to climate change, I think if you look at the mitigation efforts in the region, so far they have not been really matching the magnitude of the problem and also the potential magnitudes of those impacts from the climate change. And if you look, for example, at the level of NDCs, so national determined contribution from all the countries, you will see that, well, at least in many cases, experts believe that those are quite modest, especially if you compare them to some of the other regions, for example, compared to the average of the, for example, European Union, you would see that the NDCs in ASEAN, they are almost as half or even less than half from the average adopted across the European Union. So more can be done. And of course, many believe that the ASEAN countries have also the capacity and also should also then increase their ambition towards having more ambitious NDCs. And I think that the countries and governments are doing an important work in this area. And some believe that individual governments may actually increase their own NDCs going forward. One particular aspect which I would like to emphasize, and this is built on our work too, is that based on my experience and also interaction with some of the international institutions working in Asia, I can say that actually the overall climate funding has been growing for Asia, including for ASEAN, over the last 5 to 10 years. And I think this is a very positive development. If you look especially of how much of the climate funds were available for Asian countries before the Paris Agreement was adopted, I think this is an extremely positive development, that you have different types of funds, different types of donors providing and allocating funds for different projects that relate to climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation. So it's really positive. But at the same time, we also learned that many of the ASEAN countries, as well as other countries in Asia, they're facing the issue of the underutilization of those funds, because those funds require pretty, I would say, quick reaction. So they require a lot of fast tracking of a lot of licenses, a lot of, so to say, local support from the local authorities and governments. But this is not what's happening, especially countries that have quite limited capacity, especially governance capacity. They struggle to absorb some of those funding. And that's, of course, becoming quite an important issue where you have lots of funds available, but governments really struggle to fully utilize them. At the same time, I mean, we have many different parallel processes that are taking place, despite the fact that, for example, NDCs are quite modest. Also, if you look at the share of renewable energy across ASEAN, so far it has been quite limited. There are several countries that stand out, like, for example, Vietnam, to some extent also Malaysia, which have achieved significant progress in terms of renewable energy. Vietnam just added 11% of renewables to its energy mix just over a 4 or 5 year period, which was quite fascinating. And of course, now many look at the case of Vietnam and trying to learn what exactly actually Vietnam did in order to attract investment and then develop and deploy clean energy at such a high rate. But at the same time, other countries have also quite limited and also quite modest renewable energy targets. The target for the entire ASEAN is to achieve 23% in the total energy mix of all the ASEAN countries by 2025. And the situation today is that it's already clear that ASEAN is unlikely to achieve this 23% increase. I think we're talking about something like less than 15% compared to when this target was set back in 2015. And actually, most of this growth and most of this 15% of added clean energy is because of Vietnam's success and Vietnam's really active deployment of clean energy. So it means that many other ASEAN countries are lagging behind, and there are many avenues for them to engage and then to attract more investors, and something I will also touch upon in a moment. But also, as I said, there are many parallel processes, and we also know that technologically, for example, Malaysia, Thailand are doing quite an important work. They are really providing a lot of opportunities for technological producers. For example, in terms of photovoltaic cells, Malaysia is in the top 3 biggest producers of those. And it's also quite an important part of the economy. Thailand is also actively looking into the development of solar panels. But of course, there is, of course, this understanding that if more renewables are adopted in the region, this would lead to the economies being, strengthened, also achieving, better economic benefits for the entire economy, as well as hopefully leading to the better energy access across the region, and also lower income inequality, which of course speaks very well to what Rafael was saying about the energy justice and the just energy transition, which is especially acute across the region, which have many vulnerable communities, many of which do not have access to, for example, electricity. So if you look at, as I said, what ASEAN has been doing in terms of, for example, clean energy transition, you will see that it has been actually lagging behind some of the other global actors. So you will see that over time, if you compare to the situation back in 2006, at the beginning of the century, it was mainly the developed countries that attracted a lot of investment, and they were like the champions of renewable energy growth. Now, after 2015, this growth is taking place more in some of the developing nations across the world, of course, with China and India being the main ones. And if you look at the share of ASEAN, it has been quite limited compared to other peers. It means that there's a big room for improvement, a big way to attract a lot of investment, and just to become also quite an important and competitive basically player in this whole global race for renewable energy investment. Because so far, ASEAN has not been really part of this global trend, with the exception of Vietnam, as I just mentioned. So if you look at just numbers, I think numbers also can be a bit telling. For example, ASEAN managed to attract 27 billion US dollars in renewable energy as terms of investment. And this is what is required, but it actually attracted only 7.42 in 2018. And then in 2022, basically the time of the pandemic, the attracted investment was even lower. So it's 5 billion for the entire region. And then if you compare it to the level of subsidies, and as you know, ASEAN is actually a region, as also Rafael said, that sources a lot of energy from coal, and it means that there's a lot of energy subsidies going in to support this production of electricity from coal. And so if you compare the level of investment to the level of subsidies, you will see that, well, yes, subsidies are still very much dominant, and renewable energy investment is not really catching up with that. At the same time, what is also quite positive, if you look at the type of ASEAN policies like a regulatory regime, fiscal incentives, and financial incentives, you will see that many of the ASEAN countries, they adopted the right policies and the right legislation, using some of the best examples from other parts of the world. And this, of course, quite a promising start, because, I mean, many ASEAN countries are really adopted quite advanced legislation, as you can see, concerning, for example, feed-in tariffs, auctions, electricity, utility quota, need metering. So basically all those elements which are quite important for rapidly deploying renewable energy and attracting investment, with Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, also Thailand, Singapore being the leaders. Of course, you have also a gap in terms of such countries as Myanmar, Laos, Brunei, which still need to work in terms of adopting the right regulatory policies. However, this is no longer an important factor. So, I mean, many countries across the world, they have already renewable targets in place. So we're talking about more than 150 countries today, which have the same type of policies in place, and they also have the right enforcement mechanisms. So it's no longer possible to attract investment and also to communicate to investors that, well, you know, our country has adopted the necessary legislation and regulatory framework. So why don't you invest and consider us as an interesting market? This is because, I mean, all countries are competing basically for the same investors. And so ASEAN needs to do more. It needs really to basically make some more, I would say, serious reforms in the area of energy and also climate change governance. This is the success story of Vietnam that I just talked about. So what are the main issues to look at and what are the main barriers? I think in my understanding, and this also relates to this issue of underutilized climate funds, I think ASEAN really needs to work on improving its governance capacity to manage climate change adaptation and also the development of clean energy. Because, I mean, many investors and also international donors expect that not only legislation is in place, but also strong institutions are needed that would support the implementation of this legislation. But ASEAN is experiencing the issue of limited human resources. Most of the countries have limited ability to work with new climate funds as well as new renewable energy investment. There's also some room for improvement when it comes to financial markets and also the bankability of the projects. And I can just give an example. If you look at the current governance structure on energy in, for example, Indonesia and all other countries in the region, you will see that renewable energy and also climate change adaptation is managed by quite a limited number of staff. So usually it's part of the small unit within the, for example, Ministry of Energy that is governing, for example, renewable energy. And this is a problem because while there's limited staff, limited resources, also limited decision-making power, and often these small units like government units, they don't have capacity to reach out to some of the regions in the country, which means that, well, basically the agenda on, for example, clean energy promotion is quite slow because, I mean, you don't really have the major institutions in place that would govern it. And then you have also like big examples of countries which managed to introduce large scale and quite dramatic reforms in favor of renewable energy. So many countries, for example, established so-called they even call it ministries of renewable energy, which actually managed to attract a lot of investment because then investors usually see that, well, this country is becoming really serious because it pays more attention to this issue. And as you can see, there's so many benefits of, you know, really making a large-scale reform of the energy governance, for example, in favor of renewable energy. So this is what's not happening yet, and I think it's pretty important in light of all the challenges that ASEAN countries are facing.
Just 2 minutes left.
Yep. Thank you, Rafael. So, and then basically the last point is that, of course, ASEAN can do more in terms of getting more help and capacity building, facilitating market entry for investors, improving bankability. And the last very important point that I would like to emphasize is that ASEAN countries need to also prioritize investment in education, sustainability education for renewable energy. Together with my colleague, we just published a study where we looked at the, as you can see, the global share of degree programs in renewable energy compared to fossil fuels. And as you can see, the whole world is still very much prioritizing education fossil fuels, which results in a very significant shortages of labor for clean energy and also for dealing with climate change. As you can see here, even though Asia Pacific, which includes ASEAN, comes on the top in terms of the progress over time, by adding, for example, by adding more educational programs at universities on clean energy. This actually growth is mainly because of the large number of clean energy programs in China and India. So removing China and India would result in quite different results where most of the ASEAN countries would be lagging behind, with fossil fuel education still being the main focus of higher education institutions. So I think it's also the time to, it's actually also quite urgent to shift towards preparing the workforce that is very much needed to promote clean energy, and also then to staff governance institution as well as the other relevant institutions that would work on clean energy and also work on issues that relate to climate change adaptation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So we'll go straight over to Brian, and then we'll have the Q&A. So over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Raphael. And I'm going to continue and follow on to some of Roman and Raphael's main points. And instead of kind of focusing on the policy needs, governance needs, we're going to pull issues from the current headlines that highlight some of the climate and sustainability challenges unfolding in the region, and what the United States can do to intervene, or anyone for that matter. We're going to start with a heat wave that has been persistent this dry season in mainland Southeast Asia. The map on the right is one that my team produces through the Mekong Dam Monitor, showing that parts of Cambodia are experiencing temperatures higher than 7 degrees Celsius above normal, which is huge. And the scorching heat wave is being covered in the media, and is both attested to climate change as well as El Nino effects from the previous fall carrying over into the current time period. Now, the heat wave is expected to break as the region transitions into the wet season, but nonetheless, it is happening now. And just for perspective, we want to think about the health effects that heat has on the labor force in Southeast Asia, not just in the mainland Southeast Asia or the Mekong region. But as was mentioned earlier, the region is one of the fastest growing in the world. That means there is increasing investment in construction and infrastructure. It's a major primary producer of agricultural products too. So that means there are a lot of people outside, men and women. And the health effects of increasing heat are real. So we want to think about what kind of interventions are necessary to protect this labor force so that economic growth can continue. And that includes the type of PPE that is given to workers to prevent heat stroke, which can cause kidney disease, and heat exhaustion, and reduce efficiency. That includes retrofitting buildings and building new buildings in ways that can be resilient against the rising heat, and other services that are provided to the labor force to reduce their vulnerability to this increasing heat. Now, of course, with increasing heat, that also has the potential to intensify drought. And in mainland Southeast Asia currently, another map that's produced by my team with the Mekong Dam Monitor, we're seeing drought conditions develop through much of the Mekong Basin in mainland Southeast Asia. Those red colors that you see here also carry on to parts outside of the colored map in mainland Southeast Asia. But there is severe drought developing, again, as a result of El Nino from the past wet season, the lack of rain, the current lack of rain as well. And this has been persistent over the past 10 years, actually. What we're seeing drought form not just in the dry season, but in the wet season. Sometimes the upper basin is dry in the Mekong, but the lower is not. And sometimes the other way around is true. But currently, several provinces along Vietnam's coastline are declaring drought emergency. Now, you'll see the headline says that there's no worry for agriculture and farming, but water supply is an issue for drinking water and other uses. And one of the reasons is why you can look at the Mekong Delta there at the bottom of the map and see that it glows blue. That's not happening from natural rain occurrence. That's happening from irrigation. And the massive irrigation works that make and engineer the Mekong Delta into one of the world's most productive agricultural areas. That's done through drawing fresh water out of the river. There's less fresh water available towards the coastline due to salinity intrusion as a result of climate change. And we do see some suffering areas in that part of Vietnam at the Cà Mau Peninsula, where severe drought is sinking in. So you're seeing Vietnam deal with balancing freshwater availability, bringing it forward to prevent drought, but also some of that extraction is causing or exacerbating drought alongside the coastline as upstream takers use that water. So a better water management program could help alleviate drought and promote equity throughout the entire Mekong Delta. Now, a big issue that's percolating in mainland Southeast Asia and is starting to really be covered by international media outlets is the Funan Teco Canal, which, among many things, seeks to irrigate a portion of downstream Cambodia or lower Cambodia. And interestingly, the project, this 180-kilometer China-built canal, in its official documents, say nothing about irrigation. Yet, former Prime Minister Hun Sen in Cambodia and other media coverage of the canal in Phnom Penh are consistently talking about irrigation for this canal. And that will be taken, again, at the expense of downstream use. At the same time, Thailand is eyeing diversion from the Mekong region farther upstream, which would then, again, take more water out and away from the Cambodians and the Vietnamese downstream. So there's a real need for smarter transboundary cooperation over water resource management in the Mekong Basin, particularly during the dry season, and better mitigation related to diversions, such as the ones that I have outlined. You can learn more about the Funan Teco Canal just by Googling it. There have been scores of media articles written on it since January of this year, but this is one of the region's hottest issues right now. Coming into water availability, I mentioned that sometimes upstream, far upstream in China, there's a drought during the wet season, while the downstream does not experience these conditions. And for the last 2 years, the largest dam in the Mekong region, Nuo Jia Du, which is comparable to some of the largest dams in the United States, and it holds about a quarter of the water in the Chesapeake Bay, if you can wrap your head around that, it has only filled 50% or to comparable low levels over previous wet seasons. And this, among other dams on the Mekong and in Yunnan province on other rivers, is causing Yunnan province in southwest China to have less water availability and lower its hydroelectric output. This is actually having global shocks where the price of aluminum, since a lot of aluminum is processed both in Yunnan and China proper, is rising as a result of electricity shortages in this part of the world. So one also needs to question the benefit of massive hydropower build-out within the context of the renewable energy transition and the climate discourse. Are these investments really paying off? And when they are built, are they looking forward to consider the amount of water availability that will be there given current climate predictions? Now, Roman mentioned Vietnam's success in the solar expansion and also some wind. And that indeed is true. If we look at the investment in the project build-out in Vietnam of solar and other forms of renewable energy, and importantly, Vietnam does not consider large-scale hydropower a form of renewable energy. Just looking at the other forms, there has been a massive expansion. Something like 9 gigawatts of rooftop solar went up just a few years ago, and it was one of the largest expansions in the world. But Vietnam will not be adding new solar projects into its power expansion plan for over a decade due to a backup of investment projects that cannot be integrated into Vietnam's grid. So the concentration of solar is in a few areas of Vietnam the demand and load points are much farther away from those concentrated areas of solar, and the power can't get to its market. So there's a great need, not just in Vietnam, but in all of ASEAN for better power grid management. And a part of that power grid management is just simply investing in the infrastructure and the capacity building on how to build out and operate better power grids. There's also an opportunity for regional power trade, which allows countries to do much more in terms of power supply with a lot less power generation that's needed. Now, I know that big plans and announcements for power generation expansion are very sexy. We're seeing this such as nuclear energy expansion in the Philippines, and it means big dollars for corporations. But the real work needs to be done on grids and power systems management if a real renewable energy transition is to happen in ASEAN and the rest of the world for that matter. And one way to do that is through storage and using battery storage to store excess solar power when it's not needed, and then bring it to use later on when it is needed. And storage partially is brought forward by the extraction of critical minerals and rare earths, which is a hot topic here in Washington. And some people say that there is a global race or even a geopolitical competition unfolding over critical mineral extraction, often pointing the finger at the PRC for unsustainable and polluting measures and illegal measures related to mining in parts of Indonesia and Malaysia and Vietnam and Laos, and calls for the United States to assist or support or to push back on these bad practices coming out of the PRC as the race for critical mineral extraction deepens. Now, to what extent the United States can meet that challenge and promote sustainable critical mineral extraction in Southeast Asia and globally remains to be seen. It's going to require an effort from U.S. academic institutions, and again, this doesn't have to be a U.S.-China thing, but also from our our energy labs here, the national energy labs in the United States, and many private sector actors to jump into the mix and assist these countries with their obvious needs and calls for assistance in the critical minerals industry. And again, that can support the renewable energy transition, bring on more and more electric vehicles, and promote better power grid management so that you need fewer power generation assets in the long run. Now, just two more slides on current issues. One is about plastics. And what does plastic have to do with the renewable energy transition and climate change? Well, this week in Canada, there was an international negotiation process facilitated by the United Nations. It's the fifth round of negotiation over a global plastics treaty. And what this is trying to do is engage corporations, not just the consumers, to reduce their plastic consumption, but to engage corporations to reduce their plastic production. Today, microplastics can be found probably in every human on this planet, as well as every living being in every part of the world, all of our rivers and our oceans. And these plastics, through every part of their product cycle, deliver health impacts to, again, to our species and to the rest of the species on the planet. And as the renewable energy transition deepens, the oil producers are losing out. But we have to remember that plastic is produced from petroleum derivatives and petroleum itself. And the petroleum producers are shifting production away from oil for energy consumption and into plastics. So the global supply of plastics is set to double in one decade and triple in the next decade. And countries in Southeast Asia are dealing with the impacts of this. We see plastic building up in cities throughout Southeast Asia. Single-use plastics are polluting banks of rivers, urban areas. Manila is, as you see on this slide, is beginning to confront this issue. But these rivers during the monsoon periods pick up all the plastic on the banks and in the floodplains and send it right into the ocean. So greater efforts are needed internationally to reduce both the supply and the demand or the consumption of single-use plastics. And this is a grand opportunity for both the United States and ASEAN to coordinate in order to improve health outcomes and environmental outcomes in the region. And just coming back to the major point is that these countries alone can't go at these problems without strengthening regional cooperation. So again, here's an opportunity for ASEAN, as well as for the United States and Western development partners, to engage with regional programmatic interventions that strengthen regional cooperation. Bilateral investments in, say, Mekong fish conservation in Cambodia, or countering IUU fishing in the Philippines are not going to pay off without stronger regional action and putting dollars into regional action and regional collaboration, because these are transboundary regional issues, whether it is the mighty Mekong fishery, where a fifth of the Mekong's fishery, which by the way is the world's largest inland fish catch, responsible for 20% of the world's fish production, whether that fishery is challenged, or the fishery of the ocean in the South China Sea is challenged by IUU fishing. Bilateral approaches are not going to solve these issues. It's going to require regional cooperation on data sharing, on smart management of resources and collaboration. Again, one-to-one country opportunities are not going to bring solutions forward. And in fact, they're going to waste a lot of US taxpayer dollars through, say, USAID programs or other development interventions. Focusing on the regional and the transboundary is extremely important. Okay, so that's my presentation. Happy to go to some questions for discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you both for those presentations. Different focuses, but clearly giving the same message of actions and views on climate change, sustainability, and the energy transition. So do we have any questions in the chat? You can send them directly in the chat, or you can send them directly to me. But let's begin with one question, and that is I suppose it could apply to both of you. So we'll maybe take Roman first. And the question is, how can investment happen at a faster rate than it currently is to address these challenges? Because it still seems that more money is going into polluting and fossil fuel activity than clean energy or sustainability initiatives. So maybe Roman first.
Well, thank you very much, Rafael. That's a very good question. I think you're absolutely right that there are two parallel processes taking place. One is, of course, the focus on renewable energy capacity and what ASEAN can do to improve it and to increase it, how much of new investment it can attract to clean energy. But at the same time, you're absolutely right that there's a parallel process of continuing investment in fossil fuel industries. You still have the fossil fuel subsidies that's so far expected to grow from year to year. And of course, the coal capacity is expected to grow until at least 2040, unless some serious reforms are taking place, or like the coal phase out is sort of is becoming an important part of the reform agenda for many governments. So of course, this whole focus and continued focus on fossil fuels is a major distracting factor. because governments across ASEAN, as I said before, also they're struggling with their governance capacity. And of course, much of this capacity goes into the support and continuing utilization of energy from fossil fuel sources. And this is a problem. And in that sense, actually, also, if you look at the increasing share of renewable energy in the energy mix of some of the countries in ASEAN, you will see that this increasing share is not replacing coal, oil, and gas. It's just a response to the growing demand and the growing population. So if you look at the energy mix, you will actually see that the total consumption of fossil fuels is also growing at the same time. So in that sense, there's no real replacement and substitution. And as long as this is taking place, I think it would be really challenging for the region to fast track and make a best use of the investment going into the clean energy. So with clean energy, one should also at the same time promote the phase out of this dirty fuels. And this is where also probably you will have the issues of energy justice be very acute, because that would have to deal with many different communities. We're also talking about thousands of employees who are now employed in the oil and gas or coal sectors. And so this is the area probably is quite sensitive and difficult for governance, but without actually looking into this and finding the right responses, it will be very challenging to really promote the energy transition fast in the region.
Thank you. Brian, do you have any views on that?
Yeah, just a quick response. Not necessarily on energy, but more on sustainability. I mentioned the Funan Teco Canal, which is going to cut across a huge floodplain in Cambodia and have transboundary impacts in Vietnam. The United States and globally, there's a discussion of nature-based solutions to improve climate resilience, and that includes restoring wetlands and conserving wetlands, because often the poor of countries rely on wetlands for food and water availability and cool weather and shade and things like that. So when I briefed some U.S. government officials about the Funan Teco Canal, one of the responses was that USAID Cambodia had just put a major investment into the protection of a wetland, a large wetland that's going to be severely impacted by that canal. And again, that's just an example of a lack of communication and coordination, I think, a lack of knowledge that, say, this canal is coming down the pipeline and will deliver these impacts, and a need for more communication and coordination over such interventions. Otherwise, again, those taxpayer dollars are going to go to waste. But also at the transboundary regional level, much can be done to improve outcomes, say, in the nature-based solutions and sustainability space.
Thank you. And I think we have time just enough for one more question. And the question is addressed at Roman, but I think it also would apply to Brian. It's maybe I'm just going to add to the question because you sort of touched on some of the aspects before. The question is, you mentioned SEA governments are struggling to utilize climate funding even as it's growing. What are the challenges to that now, and what can be done to overcome that in general or by USAID? So we had that question of investment that you've just both answered, but it seems there is a challenge. Even if the money is there, there's a challenge to spend the money, and maybe so if you could answer that question quickly, and then the second part of the question, to say how could USAID, targeted USAID, try and support the expenditure of that, let's say, climate finance. Roman.
Right. Well, thank you to Kelly for this question. I think there are many concrete measures that can be implemented, and I believe that one of the most important ones is that to look at the employment side and the job creating side of energy transition in ASEAN. So in that sense, investment into the government capacity to manage projects, because based on my interactions with the policymakers in ASEAN countries, I learned that many of them have to basically, they say that, well, we have to learn what the Germans or Italian funders want from us, or the US funders or the Chinese funders. They all come with their own sort of criteria. They will say, well, you need to make an application in the portal. Then you have to basically submit all the documentation, and they often struggle to understand those criteria. So I think maybe helping governments with more capacity building and investing in some consultancy to help them actually to make use of those existing funds, which they cannot access because they simply often cannot apply and make the right proposal to get those funds. So that's one thing. Another thing which is very important is this, as I said, employment side, is to invest in education, because at the moment ASEAN is not creating many new jobs. And often it has to recruit individuals from other countries, like from India, Pakistan, and other countries. And the cost of this labor is very expensive. It means that this high costs also has implications for the installation of renewable energy. And often projects just slow down because there's no skilled labor on the ground. So that's why they have to hire from abroad. And this is very expensive. So over time, this just slows down all those projects. So I think that investing in not only education in terms of universities, but also into some short-term courses, also maybe 1-2 months of retraining programs, especially for those employees in the energy sector who would like to shift from, for example, fossil fuel sector to the renewable energy sector. So this is my response in short. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian.
No comment. I think we're at the end of our hour. Happy to take another question if there is one.
Well, any final question? Maybe just a quick question from me, Brian, just to wrap things up. We did start a few minutes late, but I was just wondering, could you give a quick, if you were to say, you highlighted many of the environmental challenges, and you touched particularly on critical minerals, and with the potential growth for critical minerals, what do you see as maybe how could USAID and like what could be done generally to try and maybe reduce some of the environmental impact as you get more and more of these projects going to happen? It seems to be a huge potential issue now and into the future.
Right. Well, one of the kind of the political economic issues that hovers around this is the refinement issue, and that often it's foreign investors or foreign actors that are mining the stuff in say Southeast Asia, and refining it and selling it. So Southeast Asians aren't part of the value chain. They're not gaining the income from the process related to critical mineral mining. So the ask is to get more out of it and have a more equitable distribution of income. And if that's going to be the case, then this is an area for capacity building, and say Western development countries can support that process. But at the same time, if more, say, local actors are involved in the refining process, then that creates issues of exposure to the minerals, as well as pollution and externalities, and a need for addressing those issues from a sustainability lens and a pollution reduction lens. So I think there's a grand opportunity there. We shouldn't see these challenges as negative or daunting. We should embrace them as opportunities for growth and for change.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Roman and Brian, for your comments. Thank you to the audience, to Keely for her question, and others. So I think it's been a very interesting discussion, and let's say a lot of issues raised, and really many of these issues could be explored in a much longer session, or perhaps they will be explored in later work from both Brian and Roman. So maybe keep an eye out for their publications in this area. So I'll hand over to Tarang for the last word and wrap up. Thank you.
Right. Thank you to Dr. Rafael Heffron, Dr. Roman Vakulchuk, and Brian Eiler for being with us for this webinar. We greatly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to share your perspectives and findings about this critical topic. Thank you to all those who have tuned in to this webinar as well. Although we are out of time, if anyone in the audience would like to follow up with our speakers, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the things we've discussed today. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.